The silver moonlight cut through the towering pines of the Appalachian Mountains, casting long shadows across the great stone circle, where 200 wolves had gathered in tense silence. The ancient arena carved from natural rock formations centuries ago by the first packs to claim these territories sat at the heart of the Eastern Pack's compound, like a beating heart made of stone and tradition. Lyra Whitethorn stood in the center of that circle, her pale skin almost luminescent under the full moon's unforgiving gaze. 23 years old and marked by the rarest condition among their kind, complete albinism, that turned her hair to spun platinum, her skin to porcelain white, and her eyes to the faintest shade of violet that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light in the darkness. She was beautiful in the way that winter itself is beautiful. Cold, untouchable, and according to pack superstition, deeply cursed. The crowd pressed in closer, their breath fogging in the October chill, their eyes hungry for the spectacle about to unfold. Rejection ceremonies were rare. Most wolves accepted their fated mates without question, understanding that the moon goddess herself chose these pairings for purposes beyond mortal comprehension. But when a rejection did occur, it became a public event, a demonstration of pack hierarchy, and the brutal reality that even divine will could be overruled by an alpha's choice. Lara kept her chin lifted, her hands steady at her sides, despite the trembling that threatened to shake through her entire body. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here. Not in front of the wolves who had whispered about her since the day she was born, who had called her cursed, who had kept their children away from her, as if albinism itself were contagious. Before we continue with Lyra's story, take a moment to comment where in the world you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories of rejected Omegas finding their true destiny, don't forget to subscribe for more. Ronan Blackburn stood across from her, tall and broad-shouldered in the way of young alphas who had never known defeat. At 28, he was the son of Elder Cornelius Ashford, one of the 3 council members who governed pack law and tradition. His dark hair was pulled back in the warrior style, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes held the golden gleam that marked him as an alpha of considerable power. He was everything an Omega was supposed to want. Strong, influential, connected to the highest levels of pack leadership. When the mate bond had snapped into place 6 months ago during the summer solstice gathering, Lyra had felt a flutter of hope despite herself. Perhaps the moon goddess had seen fit to give her a chance at normal life, at acceptance, at finally belonging somewhere other than the margins of pack society. That hope had died slowly over the following months, as Ronan made excuse after excuse to avoid her, as he refused to complete the claiming ceremony, as she caught him with other Omega females in dark corners of the compound. The bond, incomplete and one-sided without his acceptance, had felt like a rope slowly tightening around her throat. Now he was here to sever it completely. Elder Cornelius Ashford stepped forward, his 71 years evident in the silver of his hair, but not in the steel of his spine. He carried the ceremonial staff of office carved from mountain ash and inlaid with silver that caught the moonlight. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the arena with practiced authority. We gather under the full moon to witness the severing of a mate bond between Ronan Blackburn, son of this council, and Lyra Whitethorn Omega of no particular house or standing. The words were ritual, ancient, and designed to establish the power dynamic before a single rejection was spoken. Ronan Blackburn, state your claim. Ronan's jaw tightened, and for just a moment, Lyra thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, perhaps. Or maybe just annoyance at the requirement to speak his rejection aloud rather than simply walking away. He had never been particularly skilled at hiding his emotions. I, Ronan Blackburn, son of Elder Cornelius Ashford, and heir to the Blackburn line, reject you, Lyra Whitethorn, as my fated mate. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of reaction through the gathered crowd. Some gasped. Others nodded with grim satisfaction, as if they had known all along that this would be the outcome. A few of the younger wolves looked away, uncomfortable with the cruelty about to unfold, but unwilling to speak against it. But Ronan was not finished. Your cursed blood, this albinism that marks you as other, as wrong, as touched by forces that have no place in a healthy pack, is a stain upon pack purity. His voice grew stronger, more confident, as if he were reading from a speech he had practiced. Perhaps he had. You are defective, Lyra Whitethorn, unworthy of producing heirs. Your children, should you ever bear them, would carry this curse forward, weakening our bloodlines and bringing misfortune to any family foolish enough to accept you. Each word was a blade precisely placed to cause maximum damage. Lyra felt them cutting deep, finding all the places where doubt and self-hatred had already carved out hollows in her heart. She had heard variations of these words her entire life, whispered behind hands and spoken in pitying tones by wolves who thought they were being kind. But hearing them spoken aloud by the male the moon goddess had chosen for her, hearing them declared as official pack judgment, made them somehow more real, more permanent, more true. "You are a danger to our bloodline's strength," Ronan continued, and now his golden eyes met hers directly, daring her to look away. She did not. "I cast you out from any claim I might have had on you. I reject this bond. I reject you." The finality of it hung in the air like smoke. The incomplete mate bond, which had been a constant ache in Lyra's chest for 6 months, suddenly snapped with a force that drove the breath from her lungs. She gasped, her hand coming up instinctively to press against her sternum, where pain bloomed like a poisonous flower. The severance felt like being torn in half, like having a vital organ ripped from her body while she remained conscious and aware of every moment of the extraction. But she did not fall, did not cry out, did not beg him to reconsider. Instead, Lyra Whitethorn drew herself up to her full height, which was not particularly impressive compared to the wolves surrounding her, and spoke with a voice that did not waver. "I, Lyra Whitethorn, accept your rejection, Ronan Blackburn." The formal acceptance was required to complete the severance to prevent the rejected mate from clinging to false hope or attempting to force a bond that one party no longer wanted. But Lyra added words that were not part of the ritual words that came from somewhere deep inside her, where anger had been building for 23 years. "May the moon goddess judge which of us is truly defective. May she see into our hearts and determine which of us will bring shame to our bloodlines. And may she grant me the mercy of never having to see your face or hear your voice again." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Omegas did not speak like that to alphas, particularly not in formal ceremonies. It was not done. It was not proper. It was potentially dangerous depending on how the rejected alpha chose to respond. Ronan's face flushed with anger, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. For a moment, Lyra thought he might strike her, might use his alpha strength to put her back in her place. But his father's hand landed heavy on his shoulder, restraining him with the weight of council authority. "The rejection is complete," Elder Ashford announced, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "Lyra Whitethorn is hereby declared unmarriageable without specific council approval. No alpha may claim her, court her, or form any bond with her unless this council grants express permission." The pronouncement was not standard. Usually a rejected Omega was free to find another mate to move on from the failed bond and seek happiness elsewhere. But this additional restriction, this council decree that essentially locked Lyra out of any future matings, was punishment for her words, for her defiance, for daring to question the alpha who had rejected her. Lyra understood immediately what it meant. She would remain unmated for the rest of her life. She would grow old alone without the protection of an alpha, without the belonging that came from being part of a mated pair. She would exist on the margins of pack society forever. Neither fully rejected nor fully accepted, a cautionary tale told to young Omega pups about what happened when you were born wrong. The crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded. Some cast pitying glances her way. Others looked satisfied as if justice had been served. A few of the younger Omega females who had clustered around Ronan for months whispered to each other and laughed sharp sounds that carried across the stone circle like the cries of carrion birds. Lyra stood alone in the center of the arena as the wolves filed out, returning to their quarters in the sprawling compound that housed the Eastern Pack's 300 members. She remained still until the last of them had vanished into the darkness, until even the elders had retreated to their council chambers to discuss pack business that had nothing to do with her. Only then did she allow herself to move. Her legs felt weak, unsteady, as if the rejection had stolen not just her mate bond, but also her ability to support her own weight. She stumbled, once caught herself on the edge of one of the stone seats that ringed the arena, and felt the rough granite scraping against her palm. The pain was distant, unimportant compared to the gaping wound in her chest where the bond had been. Lyra made her way out of the great stone circle and through the compound's central square, past the communal dining hall, where light and laughter spilled from the windows, past the training grounds, where young warriors practiced their forms even in the darkness, past the alpha quarters, where the unmated males lived in comfort and privilege. She walked toward the Omega quarters, a collection of smaller buildings clustered at the eastern edge of the compound, as far from the prime real estate as possible, while still remaining within pack boundaries. Her room was tiny, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a trunk that held her few possessions. It was not home. It had never been home. But it was the only space in the entire territory that was truly hers. Except she found she could not bear the thought of going there tonight. could not stomach the idea of lying in that narrow bed staring at the ceiling and contemplating the rest of her life stretching out in an endless sequence of lonely nights and purposeless days. Instead, Lyra turned toward the Forbidden Woods. The forest that bordered the eastern edge of Pack territory had earned its name centuries ago when the first Alphas had claimed these mountains. The woods were dense old-growth timber that had never been logged, filled with ravines and streams and caves that could shelter rogues or predators. Pack law stated that no wolf ventured into the Forbidden Woods alone, especially not at night, especially not without Alpha permission and protection. But Lyra was already as rejected and cast out as a wolf could be, while still technically remaining part of the pack. What more could they do to her for breaking one more rule? She slipped between the trees as the full moon climbed higher in the sky, its light filtering through the canopy and the silver shafts that illuminated her path. The sounds of the compound faded behind her, replaced by the night music of the forest owls calling to each other in the darkness, small creatures rustling through the undergrowth, the distant howl of a wolf that did not belong to any pack. Lyra walked without destination, letting her feet carry her deeper into the woods, away from everything and everyone who had witnessed her public humiliation. The physical pain of the severed bond had faded to a dull ache, but the emotional wounds felt fresh and raw, as if someone had flayed her open and left her exposed to the elements. She had been 15 when her parents died. A rogue pack from the Northern Territories had launched a raid on the border, trying to steal supplies and test the Eastern Pack's defenses. Her father, a mid-ranking warrior, had responded to the alarm. Her mother, a healer, had gone to tend the wounded. Neither of them had come back. Lyra had spent the 8 years since then trying to prove she was more than just the cursed albino Omega. She worked in the healing ward, caring for elderly wolves and injured pups with a gentleness that came naturally to her. She kept her head down, avoided conflict, did everything possible to be useful and unobtrusive, and worthy of the pack's continued tolerance. And it had all been for nothing. She was still cursed, still defective, still unwanted. The sound of crying cut through her spiraling thoughts. Lyra stopped, her head tilting as she listened. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of a child in distress, high-pitched and terrified, coming from somewhere ahead and to her left. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to return to the compound, to alert the warriors that something was wrong in the Forbidden Woods. But the crying continued, growing more desperate, and Lyra found her feet moving forward before her mind had fully processed the decision. She pushed through a thick tangle of mountain laurel and emerged into a small clearing where moonlight pooled like liquid silver on the forest floor. 3 Omega pups huddled against the trunk of a massive oak tree, their small bodies pressed together as 4 rogue wolves circled them with predatory intent. The rogues were lean and scarred, their eyes holding the feral gleam of wolves who had lived outside pack law for so long that they barely remembered what it meant to be civilized. The pups could not have been more than 5 to 7 years old. Lyra recognized them from the healing ward where she worked 2 girls and a boy, children of mid-ranking pack members who let them play together unsupervised because the compound was supposed to be safe. They must have wandered too close to the border, tempted by adventure or a dare or simple childish curiosity. Now they were about to pay for that mistake with their lives, or worse. Lyra's nose caught the scent of the rogue wolves, and underneath the musk of unwashed fur and dried blood, she detected something else. Desperation, hunger, and beneath that the particular chemical signature of wolves who dealt in the trafficking trade, who stole pups and omegas and sold them to the highest bidder in the black markets that flourished in the spaces between pack territories. These rogues were not here to kill, they were here to kidnap. The largest of the 4, a gray-furred male with a chunk missing from his left ear, reached toward the smallest pup, a girl with dark braids who could not have been more than 5. His claws extended, designed to intimidate rather than harm, to terrify the children into submission. Lyra did not think, did not plan, did not consider the fact that she was 1 Omega female against 4 adult male rogues who would kill her without hesitation if she interfered with their prize. She simply moved. The silver-laced knife she carried, standard issue for all healers to use for precise cutting of herbs and bandages, was in her hand before she fully registered, drawing it from the sheath at her hip. She crossed the clearing in 4 running strides, her pale hair streaming behind her like a banner, and drove the blade into the gray rogue's shoulder with every ounce of strength she possessed. Silver-burned werewolves. Not fatally, not like the legends claimed, but enough to cause serious pain and temporary paralysis if it entered the bloodstream. The gray rogue howled, stumbling backward, his injured shoulder already beginning to smoke, where the silver burned through fur and skin. "Run!" Lyra screamed at the pups, Back to the compound now! The children scattered like startled rabbits, their small legs pumping, as they fled through the forest. Lyra heard their footsteps receding into the darkness and felt a fierce satisfaction that at least they would make it home safe. She, on the other hand, was about to die. The remaining three rogues turned their attention to her with eyes that held no mercy, no humanity, nothing but the cold calculation of predators who had been denied their prey and found a substitute target for their rage. Lyra backed up slowly, her knife held in front of her in a grip that probably looked as amateurish as it felt. She had no combat training. Omegas were not taught to fight in the Eastern Pack. They were protected, sheltered, kept safe behind walls of alpha strength and warrior skill. The knife in her hand was designed for cutting fabric, not flesh, and she had no idea how to use it against opponents who had spent years surviving through violence. The first rogue lunged. Lyra dodged left, but not fast enough. Claws raked across her right shoulder, tearing through the thin fabric of her dress and opening 4 parallel gashes that burned like lines of fire. She gasped, stumbling her back, hitting the oak tree where the pups had been cornered moments before. The second rogue came from the right, testing her defenses, looking for openings. Lyra slashed with the knife, more desperate than skilled, and felt satisfaction when the blade connected with something solid. The rogue yelped, backing off, dark blood dripping from a cut across his muzzle. But there were still 3 of them, and only one of her. The gray rogue with the burned shoulder had recovered enough to rejoin the fight rage, overcoming pain as he circled around behind her. Lyra tried to keep all 3 in her line of sight, tried to protect her back, tried to find some position that was not hopelessly exposed, but the clearing was too open and they were too experienced at this. A heavy body slammed into her from the left, driving her to the ground. The knife flew from her hand, landing somewhere in the leaf litter beyond reach. Lyra hit the ground hard, her head bouncing off exposed roots, stars exploding across her vision. Claws dug into her sides, pinning her down. Hot breath that stank of carrion and old blood washed over her face as one of the rogues leaned close. "Pretty little albino," he growled, his voice barely human, words shaped with difficulty around a muzzle designed for howling rather than speech. "The trafficking lords pay extra for rare ones like you. They'll keep you in cages, breed you until you break, sell your pups to the highest bidder." Terror flooded through Lyra's veins, cold and sharp and all-consuming. She thrashed beneath the weight, holding her down, accomplishing nothing except exhausting herself further. The wounds on her shoulder and sides burned, bleeding freely, her white dress now soaked crimson in the moonlight. This was how she would die. Or worse, this was how her life as she knew it would end, replaced by the nightmare existence of a trafficking victim kept alive only for her ability to produce children who could be sold like livestock. The rogue's claws pressed deeper, preparing to knock her unconscious for transport. And then the world exploded into violence so sudden and overwhelming that Lyra's mind could barely process what was happening. One moment the gray rogue was pinning her down, and the next moment he simply was not there anymore. A massive shape, dark and powerful and moving with impossible speed, collided with the rogue and sent him flying across the clearing. The sickening crunch of breaking bones echoed through the forest, followed by a howl of agony that cut off abruptly. A second shape appeared, equally large, intercepting the rogue who had been circling from the right. This one moved like violence made flesh, all controlled aggression and lethal precision, tearing into the rogue with claws and teeth that promised no mercy and delivered none. A third figure, slightly smaller but no less deadly, positioned himself between Lyra and the remaining rogues, a wall of muscle and protective fury that radiated alpha dominance so strong it made the air itself feel heavier. 3 wolves, 3 alphas, moving with a synchronization that spoke of years fighting together, covering each other's weaknesses, anticipating each other's moves before they were made. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted less than 30 seconds. The gray rogue died, first his neck snapped cleanly by the dark-furred alpha who had struck like thunder. The second rogue tried to run and made it perhaps 10 feet before the aggressive alpha brought him down, jaws closing around his spine with crushing force. The third and fourth rogues, seeing their companions destroyed so easily, attempted to flee in opposite directions. Neither made it out of the clearing. The alpha, who had positioned himself as Lyra's shield, moved with terrifying speed, intercepting one rogue and ending him with brutal efficiency. The dark alpha, having dispatched his first opponent, caught the final rogue before he could reach the tree line. And then it was over. 4 rogue bodies lay scattered across the clearing, their blood black in the moonlight, their threat permanently neutralized. The 3 alphas stood among the carnage, breathing hard, their eyes gleaming with the post-battle adrenaline that came from successful defense of territory and pack. Slowly, almost in unison, all 3 turned to look at Lyra. She remained on the ground where she had fallen, her back against the oak tree, her dress torn and bloody, her pale hair tangled with leaves and dirt. Every breath hurt her wounds, screaming in protest, but she could not look away from the three males who had just saved her life. They were identical in height and build, though their coloring differed slightly. One with fur so dark it was nearly black, one with brown fur shot through with gray, and one with lighter brown fur that caught the moonlight. But even in their wolf forms, there was no mistaking the power radiating from them, the alpha dominance that marked them as something far above ordinary wolves. As she watched, they shifted. The transformation from wolf to human was always slightly unsettling to witness, bones and muscles rearranging themselves in ways that should not be possible, fur receding to reveal skin muzzles shortening into human faces. Within seconds, three men stood where wolves had been. Three identical men. Triplets. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as recognition slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. Every wolf in the Eastern Territories knew these faces, even if most had never seen them in person. These were not just alphas. These were the Ravenclaw brothers, Thorndax and Grayson, who ruled three allied packs with absolute authority and legendary efficiency. They were kings, and they were all staring at her with expressions of such intense focus that Lyra felt pinned in place more effectively than when the rogue had held her down. The one with the darkest hair, who had moved like thunder and killed with such precision, stepped forward first. His face was all sharp angles and controlled strength, that distinctive alpha gaze that missed nothing, fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away and simultaneously made it impossible to do so. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice like winter wind through bare branches, cold and carrying and absolutely commanding. Before Lyra could respond, the second brother moved closer. His hair was the same shade as his siblings, but his features held more of that barely leashed violence, as if aggression was his natural state and calm required active effort. When he crouched down to her level, she could see old scars on his knuckles, evidence of a life spent fighting. "Multiple lacerations," he said, apparently speaking to his brothers rather than to her, "deep enough to require stitches. Blood loss is significant, but not immediately critical." The third brother, who had positioned himself as her shield during the fight, knelt on her other side. His face was softer somehow, though no less strong, his eyes holding something that might have been concern or might have been calculation. "Can you stand?" he asked, and his voice was gentler than his brother's, though no less alpha in tone. Lyra opened her mouth to respond, to say yes, of course she could stand. She was not some fragile thing that broke at the first sign of trouble. But when she tried to put weight on her legs, the world tilted sideways and gray crept in at the edges of her vision. Strong hands caught her before she could fall. The dark-haired brother had moved faster than should be possible, one arm sliding behind her back, the other beneath her knees, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. And then something happened that Lyra's mind could not immediately process. The moment his skin made contact with hers, she felt it. A pull, a connection, a sense of rightness so profound and overwhelming that it drove every other thought from her mind. Mate bond, but that was impossible. She had just had her mate bond severed less than an hour ago. Wolves could not form new bonds so quickly, especially not with alphas. They had never even met before. The moon goddess chose mates, carefully pairing wolves whose strengths and weaknesses complemented each other, whose personalities balanced. It took time for bonds to form, weeks or months of proximity and interaction. And yet there it was, blazing in her chest like a newborn star, filling the hollow place where Ronan's rejected bond had left a wound. The dark-haired alpha's eyes widened fractionally, the only sign that he felt it too. His grip on her tightened not painfully but possessively, and his head turned sharply toward his brothers. "Do you feel?" he started to say. "Yes," the aggressive brother interrupted, his voice rough with something that might have been shock or wonder or perhaps fear. "Impossible. There's no way." "I feel it too," the gentle brother confirmed, and now his expression had shifted from concern to something else entirely, something fierce and possessive and absolute. "She's calling to all three of us." Lyra's mind was spinning, trying to process what they were saying, what it meant. Calling to all three of them. As if one mate bond was not enough, as if the moon goddess had somehow decided to tie her to not one alpha, but three to brothers who were already bound together by blood and shared destiny. It should not be possible, but the goddess-forged link blazing in her chest did not care about possibility. It cared only about inevitability, about rightness, about the sudden absolute certainty that these three males were hers, and she was theirs, and nothing in the world would ever change that fundamental truth. "Who are you?" the dark-haired Alpha demanded, though his tone had shifted from commanding to something almost reverent. "What's your name?" "Lyra," she managed to say, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Lyra Whitethorn." The three brothers exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them, in the way of wolves who had known each other their entire lives. "Lyra Whitethorn," the dark-haired Alpha repeated as if testing how her name felt in his mouth. "I'm Thorn Ravenclaw. These are my brothers Dax and Grayson. And you, Lyra, are coming with us." It was not a request. It was not even really a command. It was simply a statement of fact delivered with the absolute confidence of an Alpha who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. Lyra should have protested, should have demanded to be returned to the pack compound to the healing ward, where someone could tend her wounds, to the tiny room that was not home, but was at least familiar. Should have reminded them that she was unmated by council decree, that no Alpha could claim her without explicit permission from Elder Ashford and his council. But awareness of the three Alphas sang through her veins, drowning out every logical thought, every practical objection, every voice of caution that had kept her safe for 23 years. And when Thorn Ravenclaw began walking deeper into the Forbidden Woods, carrying her in his arms as if she were something precious rather than cursed, something to be treasured rather than cast aside, Lyra found she had no desire to protest at all. Behind them, Dax and Grayson fell into formation, one on each side, creating a protective triangle that enclosed her completely. The moonlight filtered through the trees, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow, and Lyra Whitethorn, the cursed albino Omega, who had been rejected and cast out and declared unmarriageable just hours before, felt something she had not felt in 8 years. She felt safe. The Ravenclaw estate revealed itself gradually through the dense forest, like a secret being reluctantly shared. Lyra had lived her entire life within the Eastern Pack's territory, but she had never ventured this deep into the wilderness that bordered the compound. No one did. The Forbidden Woods were exactly that, forbidden, and the lands beyond belonged to wolves of such power that even speaking their names carried weight. Thorn Ravenclaw carried her as if she weighed nothing, his stride never faltering, despite the difficult terrain of roots and rocks and fallen logs. His brothers moved on either side, their eyes constantly scanning the darkness for threats that Lyra suspected would be foolish to appear. The trees began to thin, and suddenly they were standing at the edge of a clearing that held a structure so at odds with the wild forest surrounding it that Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The estate was built from mountain stone and timber, 3 stories tall, with wide windows that reflected the moonlight like watching eyes. It sprawled across the clearing in a way that suggested organic growth, rather than rigid planning, with wings extending in different directions, as if rooms had been added over generations according to need rather than aesthetic. Lanterns burned in several windows, casting warm golden light that spilled across a courtyard paved with flat stones and bordered by gardens that, even in October's chill, showed signs of careful tending. This was not a house. This was a stronghold, a place of power that announced without words that the wolves who lived here answered to no authority except their own. "Home," Grayson said simply, though whether he was announcing their arrival to her or to some unseen presence, Lyra could not tell. The massive front doors opened before they reached them, and a woman stood framed in the entrance. She was perhaps 58 years old. Her dark hair shot through with silver, her face bearing the lines of someone who had smiled often and worried more. She wore practical clothing, trousers, and a tunic that marked her as pack rather than human, and her gaze went immediately to Lyra with the focused intensity of someone trained to assess injuries. "Blessed moon," the woman breathed, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. "What happened?" "Rogues," Dax said shortly, his voice still carrying the edge of violence from the fight. 4 of them trafficking trade, going after 3 pups from the Eastern Pack compound. She fought them alone. The woman's eyes widened fractionally as she took in what that meant, an Omega untrained facing 4 adult male rogues without backup or weapons beyond a healer's knife. Her attention moved from Lyra's face to the wounds visible through her torn and bloodied dress, cataloging damage with professional efficiency. "Bring her to the healing room," the woman said, already turning and moving deeper into the house. "I'll need hot water, clean bandages, and the suture kit. Grayson, fetch the silver salve. Those claw marks will need treatment to prevent infection." The interior of the estate was as impressive as the exterior. High ceilings supported by massive timber beams. Stone floors covered with thick rugs that muffled footsteps. Furniture that looked both comfortable and expensive, the kind of pieces that lasted generations. Artwork on the walls showing forest scenes and wolf packs under various phases of the moon. Thorn carried Lyra through a series of hallways and into a room that was clearly designed as a medical facility. A long table stood in the center, its surface covered with clean white sheets. Cabinets lined one wall, their glass doors revealing neat rows of medical supplies. The scent of antiseptic and healing herbs hung in the air, familiar and oddly comforting. He laid her down on the table with surprising gentleness for someone who had just killed two wolves with his bare hands. His gaze met hers, irises the color of moonlight on steel, and Lyra saw something in them that she could not quite identify. Concern mixed with possessiveness, mixed with something else that made her stomach flutter, despite the pain radiating from her wounds. "This is Dr. Evangeline Frost," Thorne said, gesturing to the woman who was already pulling supplies from the cabinets with practiced efficiency. "She served our family for 30 years and is the finest healer in the territories. You can trust her." Dr. Evangeline approached the table, her hands gentle, as they began examining Lyra's injuries. "I'm going to need to cut away the dress," she said quietly. "It's too damaged to save, and I can't properly treat you with fabric in the way." Lyra nodded, not trusting her voice. The adrenaline that had carried her through the fight and the impossible revelation of the triple mate bond was fading now, leaving behind exhaustion and pain and a bone-deep weariness that made even breathing feel like effort. Dr. Evangeline worked with efficient precision, using scissors to remove the ruined dress until Lyra lay in only her undergarments, her pale skin stark against the white sheets. The healer's intake of breath was audible when the full extent of the injuries became visible. 4 parallel claw marks across Lyra's right shoulder, deep enough that white bone was visible at the bottom of one furrow. Multiple puncture wounds along her sides where teeth or claws had dug in while pinning her down. Bruising already forming across her ribs and back from where she had hit the ground. Scrapes and cuts on her arms and legs from fighting through underbrush. "You should be dead," Dr. Evangeline said bluntly, though her tone held admiration rather than accusation. 4 rogues against 1 Omega, no training, no backup. You should not have survived. "The pups," Lyra managed to say through lips that felt numb. "Did they make it back?" Grayson, who had returned with a jar of silver-colored salve, answered from his position near the door. "We sent word to the Eastern Pack compound as soon as we reached the estate. 3 pups arrived safely approximately 20 minutes ago, frightened but unharmed. They're telling everyone about the brave Omega who saved them from the bad wolves." Relief flooded through Lyra with such intensity that tears pricked at her eyes. The children were safe. Whatever happened to her now, whatever price she had to pay for interfering, for fighting, for surviving, at least those 3 pups would grow up to have futures that had not been stolen by trafficking lords. "Doctor." Evangeline began cleaning the wounds, her touch as gentle as possible, but still causing pain that made Lyra's hands clench into fists. The healer worked in silence for several minutes before speaking again. "I need to know if you consent to treatment," she said quietly. "Pack law requires that I ask, especially given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" Lyra asked, confusion cutting through the pain. "You're unclaimed," Dr. Evangeline said carefully. "And you're in the home of 3 unmated alpha males who, unless I'm very much mistaken, have just discovered you're their mate. I need to know if you're here by choice or if you need me to arrange transport back to your pack." The question hung in the air like smoke. Lyra could feel 3 sets of eyes on her, Thorndax and Grayson, all watching to see how she would answer. The tether between them grew taut with emotion, pulling her toward them with an intensity that felt like gravity itself. She thought about returning to the Eastern Pack compound, thought about her tiny room in the Omega quarters, about the whispers that would follow her after tonight's rejection ceremony, about Elder Ashford's decree that she was unmarriageable without council permission. Thought about spending the rest of her life on the margins, tolerated but never accepted, useful but never valued. Then she thought about how Thorne had caught her before she could fall, how Dax had assessed her injuries with clinical efficiency that spoke of genuine concern, how Grayson had positioned himself as her shield without being asked. Thought about that inexplicable rightness settled in her chest, telling her that these 3 males were hers and she was theirs and nothing else mattered. "I consent to treatment," Lyra said firmly, "and I'm here by choice." She saw the tension leave Dr. Evangeline's shoulders, saw something that might have been approval flash across the healer's face. The 3 brothers did not move, did not speak. But the air in the room seemed to shift, somehow becoming warmer, more settled. "Good to," Dr. Evangeline said simply and returned to her work with renewed focus. The process of cleaning and stitching the wounds took nearly an hour. Dr. Evangeline worked with the skill of someone who had done this hundreds of times before, her hands steady as she closed the deepest lacerations with neat stitches that would minimize scarring. The silver salve went on last, a paste that burned like ice and fire combined, but would prevent infection and speed healing beyond what even werewolf regeneration could accomplish alone. Through it all, the three Ravenclaw brothers remained in the room. Thorn stood near Lyra's head, his presence a solid anchor that kept her grounded through the worst of the pain. Dax paced near the door, his restless energy barely contained, occasionally growling low in his throat when Dr. Evangeline's ministrations caused Lyra to gasp. Grayson watched everything with those observant eyes, saying nothing but missing nothing. Finally, Dr. Evangeline stepped back, surveying her work with critical assessment. You'll need to rest for at least 3 days. No shifting, no strenuous activity, and you'll need to keep the wounds clean and dry. I'll check on you tomorrow morning to ensure there's no infection developing. She turned to face the three brothers, her expression shifting from professional healer to something more maternal, almost scolding. And you three need to remember that she's injured. I don't care what the mate bond is telling you to do, she needs time to heal before any claiming ceremonies occur. Am I making myself clear? Dax actually looked sheepish while Grayson nodded solemnly. Thorne's expression remained unreadable, but he inclined his head in acknowledgement. We understand, he said. We'll take her to the guest room in the East Wing. She'll have privacy and space. Dr. Evangeline looked like she wanted to say more, but apparently decided against it. Instead, she gathered her supplies, gave Lyra one last examining look, and headed for the door. She paused at the threshold, glancing back. Welcome to Ravenclaw Estate, Lyra Whitethorn, she said quietly. I have a feeling things are about to become very interesting around here. Then she was gone, leaving Lyra alone with 3 Alpha Kings, an awareness of them blazing with increasing intensity now that the distraction of treatment had ended. For a long moment, no one spoke. Lyra lay on the table, covered by a clean sheet that Dr. Evangeline had draped over her, acutely aware of her near-nakedness and vulnerability. The pain medication the healer had given her was starting to work, making everything feel slightly distant and dreamlike. Thorn broke the silence first. We need to talk about what happens now. What happens now? But Lyra echoed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. I was rejected and declared unmarriageable less than 2 hours ago. And now I'm mated to 3 Alpha Kings who I've never even met before tonight. I'm not sure there's a protocol for this situation. Dax laughed, a short bark of sound that held genuine amusement. No, there's definitely no protocol. Triple mate bonds are supposed to be impossible. We've spent 30 years looking for an Omega who could connect with all 3 of us, and every healer, every elder, every wise wolf we consulted said it couldn't happen. That the moon goddess doesn't work that way. And yet here you are, Grayson added softly, calling to all 3 of us with equal intensity, creating a bond that shouldn't exist but absolutely does. Lyra's mind was trying to process this information through the haze of pain and medication. 30 years, she repeated. You've been looking for 30 years. We were born during a blood moon. Thorn explained, his voice taking on the cadence of a story told many times. Triplets are rare among our kind, maybe one set every few generations. Triplet alphas are almost unheard of. Our mother died bringing us into the world, the strain of carrying 3 alpha pups too much for even her considerable strength. He paused and something flickered across his face, old grief carefully controlled, but never fully buried. Our father raised us, he continued, taught us that we were meant to rule together, that our strength came from our unity. But he also warned us that finding mates would be nearly impossible. Most Omegas bond to a single alpha. The thought of sharing, of creating a triad or triangle bond, goes against every instinct they have. We've had Omegas offer themselves, Dax said, and his tone suggested this was not a pleasant memory. Dozens over the years. Some wanted the power that would come from being mated to kings. Some were ordered by their alphas to seduce us for political alliances. Some genuinely believed they could handle a bond with all 3 of us. But the bond never formed, Grayson finished. We could force a claiming, could mark an Omega, and call it a mating, but without the true mate bond created by the moon goddess herself, it would be empty. A political arrangement, nothing more. Lyra listened to them explain, trying to understand the magnitude of what they were describing. 30 years of searching, 30 years of failed attempts and disappointed hopes, 30 years of being told that what they needed could not exist. And then she had stumbled into their territory, bleeding and terrified and fighting to protect children who were not even hers, and the impossible had become real. I don't understand why, she said quietly. I'm nobody. I'm cursed, defective, unmarriageable. I was rejected by my fated mate because my bloodline is too weak, too wrong, too damaged to be worth preserving. Why would the moon goddess choose me for this? The words came out more bitter than she had intended, carrying 8 years of accumulated hurt and rejection and self-doubt. Thorn moved closer to the table, his hand coming to rest on the sheet near her shoulder, careful not to touch her injured skin, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You are not cursed," he said, and his voice carried such absolute conviction that Lyra almost believed him. "You are not defective, and you are certainly not unmarriageable, Elder Ashford's decree notwithstanding." "My albinism," Lyra started to say, but Dax cut her off. "Is beautiful," he said flatly. "You look like moonlight, given form like winter itself, and chose to walk among us. Any alpha who rejected you for that is a fool who deserves to spend the rest of his life regretting his choice." "The pack says it's a curse," Lyra insisted, needing them to understand what they were taking on. "They say children born with albinism bring misfortune. That my parents died because of me, because I was born wrong." "Your parents died defending their pack from rogues," Grayson said gently. "That's what warriors do, what healers do. They sacrifice themselves to protect those weaker. Their deaths were honorable, not punishment for your existence." He moved to stand on the other side of the table, his gray eyes meeting hers with uncomfortable intensity. "As for pack superstition about albinism," he continued, "I've spent years studying ancient texts about our kind, about the old ways before packs became so isolated and insular. Do you know what I found?" Lyra shook her head, not trusting her voice. "References to moon-blessed wolves," Grayson said. "Wolves born with alabaster coats and eyes that held starlight. They were considered sacred, marked by the moon goddess herself for special purposes. They were healers and seers, protectors, and peacemakers. They were treasured, not cast aside." "But that's just legend," Lyra protested weakly. "Old stories that people made up to explain things they didn't understand." "Maybe," Grayson acknowledged, "or maybe your pack has forgotten truths that other territories still remember. Maybe what they call a curse is actually a blessing so old that its meaning has been lost." The possibility was too enormous to contemplate fully. Lyra's entire life had been built on the foundation of being wrong, being damaged, being less than. The idea that she might instead be more than that, her difference might be sacred rather than shameful, felt like standing on ground that was suddenly shifting beneath her feet. "I need time," she said finally, "to think about this, to understand what this bond means. I'm not ready to." "Oh, we know," Thorne said, and his voice had gentled slightly. Dr. Evangeline was correct. "You're injured and exhausted, and you've been through multiple traumas in one night. We're not going to rush you into anything. But we do need you to understand something," Dax added, and his tone made it clear this was important. "The mate bond has formed. That's not something that can be undone or ignored. You're ours now, Lyra Whitethorn, and we are yours. That's a reality that exists independent of what you decide to do about it." The possessive certainty in his voice should have been frightening, should have triggered every self-preservation instinct Lyra possessed. But instead, she felt that connection in her chest respond with warmth and satisfaction, as if this claiming, even verbal rather than physical, was exactly what some deep part of her had been waiting for. "What about Elder Ashford's decree?" Lyra asked, grasping for practical concerns to anchor herself. "I'm unmarriageable without council permission. If you claim me, you'll be violating pack law." The three brothers exchanged glances, and Lyra saw something pass between them that might have been amusement or might have been anticipation of conflict. "Elder Cornelius Ashford has authority over the Eastern Pack," Thorne said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "He does not have authority over the Ravenclaw territories. We rule 3 allied packs, Northern, Eastern, and Southern. The Eastern Pack you were born into is part of our coalition, which means Ashford's council answers to us, not the other way around." The implications of that statement took a moment to fully penetrate Lyra's pain and medication-hazed mind. "You're saying his decree doesn't apply to you." "We're saying his decree is irrelevant," Dax corrected. "If we choose to claim you, no council in any territory has the authority to prevent it. We are alphas of the highest rank. We bow to no one except the moon goddess herself." It was a bald statement of power that would have been arrogant coming from anyone else. But from 3 kings who ruled territories spanning hundreds of miles, who commanded the loyalty of thousands of wolves, who had just dispatched 4 rogues with the casual efficiency of apex predators dealing with minor irritations. It was simply fact. "But claiming me would cause political problems," Lyra said, thinking through the consequences. "Ronan Blackburn is Elder Ashford's son. If you take me as mate after Ronan publicly rejected me, it will look like you're undermining his authority. It will look like you're saying his judgment about me was wrong." "His judgment about you was wrong," Grayson said simply. "And yes, claiming you will cause political problems. We're prepared for that." "Are you?" Thorne asked, and the intense stare of a born leader pinned her in place more effectively than any physical restraint. "Prepared for it, I mean. Because if we complete this bond, if we officially claim you as our mate, you won't just be an Omega anymore. You'll be Luna of 3 packs. You'll have authority second only to ours. You'll be responsible for thousands of wolves who will look to you for leadership and guidance. The prospect was overwhelming enough that Lyra felt dizzy. Her a Luna. Her responsible for anything beyond sweeping floors and changing bandages. Her in a position of authority over wolves who had spent her entire life looking down on her. I don't know how to be a Luna, she admitted. I don't know anything about pack politics or territory management or any of the things I'd need to know. You fought 4 rogues to protect 3 pups who weren't even yours, Dax said. You stood up to your rejecting mate in front of the entire pack instead of accepting his cruelty in silence. You negotiated consent for medical treatment even while injured and in pain. Those are the qualities of a Luna Lyra. The rest can be taught. But first, Thorne said, and his voice took on that commanding tone that made it clear the discussion period was over. You need to rest and heal. Grayson helped me get her to the guest room. Before Lyra could protest that she was capable of walking, Thorne had scooped her up again, sheet and all, cradling her against his chest with the same ease he had shown in the forest. The movement jostled her injuries enough to cause a spike of pain, but his body heat and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat were oddly soothing. They carried her through more hallways, up a wide staircase with carved banisters, and into a room that was larger than her entire Omega quarters back at the compound. A massive bed dominated one wall, piled high with pillows and covered in a thick quilt that looked handmade. Windows overlooked the forest, currently showing only darkness and the faint glow of moonlight. A fireplace stood ready with wood already laid, needing only a match to bring warmth to the space. Thorne laid her on the bed with careful precision, arranging pillows behind her back so she could sit slightly upright without putting pressure on her shoulder wounds. Grayson moved to light the fire, and within moments, warmth began spreading through the room. There's a bathroom through that door, Dax said, pointing to a door on the left. It's fully stocked with anything you might need. One of us will be right outside if you need help or if anything hurts too much to manage alone. You're going to stand guard, Lyra asked, and she could not quite keep the incredulity from her voice. You're our mate, Thorne said, as if this explained everything. You're injured. You're in a strange place. Yes, we're going to stand guard. At least one of us will be within earshot at all times until you're healed. The protectiveness should have felt suffocating, should have triggered memories of being watched and judged and found wanting. But instead, it made the connection in her chest glow with satisfaction, with the feeling of being valued and treasured and protected. I have conditions. Lyra heard herself say the words emerging before her mind had fully approved them. All 3 brothers went still, their attention focusing on her with laser intensity. Go on, Thorne said carefully. Lyra took a breath, gathering her scattered thoughts through the haze of medication and exhaustion. I need time before any claiming ceremony happens. I need to understand what this bond means, what being your mate would require. I need to know that I'm choosing this, not just being swept along by biology and fate. She paused, then continued with more firmness. No permanent marks until I'm ready. No public announcements until we've figured out how this works. And if I decide I can't do this, if the reality doesn't match what the bond is telling me should be right, I need to know I can leave. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to have physical weight. Lyra watched emotions flicker across 3 identical faces: surprise, consideration, respect, and underneath it all, that alpha possessiveness that did not want to agree to any possibility of her leaving. Finally, Thorne spoke. We accept your terms, with one condition of our own. What condition? Lyra asked warily. Give us 7 days, he said. 7 days living here, getting to know us, learning what this bond could become. At the end of 7 days, if you truly want to leave, we won't stop you. But we also won't make it easy. We'll spend every moment of those 7 days proving to you that you belong here with us. It was not quite agreement to her terms, but it was closer than Lyra had expected from 3 Alpha Kings who were used to getting exactly what they wanted. 7 days. A week to figure out if the impossible connection humming in her chest was real or just biology playing tricks on her traumatized mind. 7 days, she agreed, but no forced intimacy, no using the bond to manipulate my emotions, and no punishment if I decide to leave. Deal, Dax said immediately, and Grayson nodded agreement. Thorne studied her for a long moment, eyes that gleamed with predatory focus unreadable. Then he extended his hand, palm up, in the traditional gesture of oath-taking among wolves. 7 days, he confirmed. No forced intimacy, no emotional manipulation, no punishment, regardless of your choice. You have my word. as Alpha of the Northern Pack. And mine, Dax added, placing his hand over his brother's. As Alpha of the Southern Pack. And mine, Grayson finished, completing the stack. As Alpha of the Eastern Pack. Lyra reached out with her uninjured hand, placing it on top of theirs. The moment her skin made contact, she felt them through the goddess-forged link with such intensity that she gasped, feeling an echo of what all three of them were feeling. Determination. Possessive need, fierce protectiveness, and underneath it all, hope so fragile it made her chest ache. 7 days, she whispered, and felt the oath settle into place with the weight of pack law and divine witness. The brothers withdrew their hands slowly, reluctantly, and Lyra could see the effort it cost them to step back to give her space to honor the bargain they had just made. Rest now, Thorn said, his voice gentler than she had yet heard it. Tomorrow, when you're stronger, we'll start showing you what being our mate truly means. They filed out of the room one by one, each pausing at the door to look back as if committing the sight of her to memory. Dax was last, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. That Alpha who rejected you, he said quietly. Ronan Blackburn, he's going to regret what he did for the rest of his life. Because when you stand beside us as Luna, when every wolf in 3 territories sees what we see, he'll understand exactly what he threw away. Then he was gone, closing the door with a soft click, leaving Lyra alone in a room warmed by firelight, with the connection blazing in her chest and 7 days stretching ahead that would determine the entire course of her future. She lay back against the pillows, her body aching and exhausted, but her mind racing too fast for sleep. 24 hours ago, she had been preparing for a rejection ceremony, steeling herself to endure public humiliation and spend the rest of her life on the margins of pack society. Now she was mated to 3 kings lying in a room more luxurious than anywhere she had ever stayed, with promises of being taught what being a Luna meant. The moon goddess Elira thought distantly, as sleep finally began to claim her, had a twisted sense of humor. But as awareness of them settled warm and steady in her chest, as she felt the presence of 3 alphas standing guard just beyond her door, as she finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was not cursed after all, Lyra found she could not quite bring herself to complain about the divine sense of humor that had brought her here. 7 days to decide her future. 7 days to discover if the impossible bond was real. 7 days to learn if she could be the Luna that 3 kings needed. The firelight flickered and danced, casting shadows across the ceiling as Lyra Whitethorn, the albino Omega who had been cast aside and declared unmarriageable, finally surrendered to exhaustion and allowed sleep to claim her. Outside her door, 3 brothers stood in the hallway, none willing to be the first to walk away, all bound by an oath to give her time and space, but unable to fully leave while she was injured and vulnerable and theirs. She's going to choose us, Dax said quietly, and it was unclear whether he was stating a fact or trying to convince himself. She has to, Grayson added. The bond is too strong. She felt it as clearly as we did. Thorn said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the closed door as if he could see through it to where their mate lay sleeping. She'll choose us, he finally said, and his voice carried the weight of prophecy and determination combined. Because we're going to prove to her that she's not cursed. She's blessed, and she's exactly what we've been waiting 30 years to find. The 3 brothers stood vigil through the night, taking turns pacing the hallway, unable to rest, while their newly discovered mate slept beyond a door they had promised not to cross without permission. And in the room, Lyra dreamed. But these were not the nightmares that had haunted her for 8 years, visions of rejection and isolation and dying alone in the margins. These dreams were different, painted in shades of silver and gold and promise. She saw herself months from now standing before thousands of wolves with 3 claiming marks blazing on her throat and shoulders. Saw the Eastern Pack, the Northern Pack, the Southern Pack, all gathered to witness a Luna ceremony that would reshape territorial politics for generations. She saw Ronan's face in the crowd, pale with regret, understanding too late what he had thrown away. Saw Elder Ashford forced to bow before her, acknowledging her authority. Saw every wolf who had whispered cursed, learning to whisper blessed instead. But more than that, deeper than political victory, she saw home. A nursery with 3 cribs each carved from different wood. Northern pine for the first, southern oak for the second, eastern maple for the third. 3 babies with alabaster hair and eyes that shifted between violet and silver depending on the light. Moon-blessed children, the first of their kind in centuries. Living proof that what the pack had called a curse was actually the rarest blessing the goddess could bestow. She saw herself older, surrounded by grandchildren, teaching them the old ways that had been forgotten. Saw the Ravenclaw dynasty stretching into the future generation after generation, all carrying the mark of the moon, blessed in their bloodlines. Saw 3 kings growing old beside her. their hands still reaching for her first thing every morning, their devotion never wavering, even when their dark hair turned silver and their powerful bodies began to slow. Saw a legacy built not on conquest or domination, but on the simple truth that sometimes the moon goddess chose the most unlikely vessels for her greatest purposes. The dreams shifted, showing her the 7 days ahead. Training sessions where Dax would teach her to fight his hands gentle, even when correcting her form. Afternoon lessons with Grayson, his patient voice explaining politics and strategy, until she understood pack dynamics better than wolves who had studied them for decades. Evening walks with Thorn, his controlled exterior cracking to reveal the male beneath who had waited 30 years for her. She saw herself falling in love with them one day at a time. Not the instant overwhelming passion of a mate bond, though that was there too, thrumming beneath everything, but something deeper. The slow recognition of partnership, of belonging, of finally finding the place she was always meant to stand. And at the end of 7 days, she saw herself taking their hands without hesitation, without doubt, without fear. Saw herself saying yes. The dream began to fade as dawn approached, reality bleeding back in through the edges. But the certainty remained. The knowledge that this was not just possible, it was inevitable. The moon goddess had brought her here for a reason, and Lyra Whitethorn, the cursed albino Omega who had been rejected and cast aside and declared unmarriageable, was finally ready to accept her destiny. Not because 3 Alpha Kings wanted her, but because she was beginning to want herself. Outside her door, 3 brothers felt the moment her dreams settled into something peaceful through the bond they shared. "She's dreaming," Grayson said softly, wonder coloring his usual measured tone. "About us," Dax added, feeling the echo of images he could not quite see, but somehow knew were there. Thorn smiled, rare and genuine. "About the future. Our future. She's already ours, she just doesn't know it yet." 7 days, Grayson murmured. 7 days, Dax agreed. "And then forever," Thorn finished. The 3 brothers stood vigil through the night, waiting for dawn to begin their courtship of the Omega who would change everything. Waiting to prove to her what they had known from the moment they caught her scent in the Forbidden Woods. That sometimes the moon goddess's greatest gifts came wrapped in the most unexpected packages. And that Lyra Whitethorn, cursed, defective, unmarriageable Lyra Whitethorn, was the greatest gift they would ever receive.